Well, good morning. I've got a few slides for you on Washington Irving, who was one of America's earliest romantic voices. It's always been interesting to me that Washington Irving spent a large chunk of time, his formative years really, and ultimately 17 years through Europe. That a writer that is so well known for the American experience and the American landscape and for creating some of its earliest myths and legends spent so much time abroad. You can see here he worked as an importer in Liverpool, England, and then as an attaché to the American delegation, I think is what it should say, in Spain, and finally as secretary to the American delegation in London. In fact, some people sort of read Rip Van Winkle and Rip's 20-year sleep that he does as sort of the similar experience that Irving must have had, being gone from his country for nearly 20 years and then coming back to America from his European travels. He must have felt as though he had slept through quite a bit of time, and coming back to a country that he in some ways may not have recognized as the same country he left. Irving's writings were numerous and diverse. They range from the life and voyages of Christopher Columbus, the Alhambra, both written during his stay while in Spain, and a tour of the prairies and the adventures of Captain Bonneville, 1837, studies of the American West, written on his return from Europe, and also wrote a 5-volume biography of George Washington. Washington Irving is known primarily and studied primarily, though, for one work. His major contribution is known as the Sketchbook, published in 1819 and 1820, both in America and in London, which included the classics Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In fact, the Sketchbook, and these two pieces primarily, I think, are his most recognized and important contribution to American literature. Upon his return to America in 1832, Washington Irving was celebrated as one of the first American authors to meet with international acclaim and success. Perhaps James Fenimore Cooper was the other. Because he was abroad for so long, though, some questioned his American spirit. So he may have written the following passage, which comes from Tour of the Prairies, as a way to settle and secure his public persona as an American voice. Quote, "We send our youth abroad to grow luxurious and effeminate in Europe. It appears to me that a previous tour on the prairies would be more likely to produce that manliness, the simplicity, and self-dependence most in unison with our political institutions." Irving also really is one of America's earliest humorists. So the humor that is in Irving is a dry humor. It's a witty humor. It's a humor that is derived in part through his unique characters, who are always memorable and quirky. He has in his stories his plots within what he called his histories. They do have surprising twists and turns if you think about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and really the story that we're focusing in on, Rip Van Winkle, certainly has surprising twists and plots to it. As I mentioned, his characters are always very memorable, and they're often very unusual and idiosyncratic, and that's certainly the case with Rip. It's the case with Ichabod Crane, if you've read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The physical descriptions of people and places are a way that Irving also achieves his humor. His oftentimes unreliable narrators. We haven't talked much about this in class thus far, so let me introduce this idea to you that a writer can create a narrator, that is, the voice that we hear telling the story, but sometimes that voice, that narration, the person who's telling the story, does not always come across as being reliable or believable. And if you look at the end of Rip Van Winkle, the beginning and the end of it, Irving uses what's called a narrative frame, where the narrator introduces his story and then closes his story at the end. That's the end of the frame. But it's in the narrative frame, in the introductions and in the conclusions of the stories, the paragraphs that sort of sandwich the story, if you will, where you see the narrator speaking in such a way that we're not always convinced that he's telling us the truth. Here's an example of the irony and the humor that we sometimes see in Rip Van Winkle. This is a passage from the story. In fact, he declared it was of no use to work on his farm. It was the most pestilent little piece of ground in the whole country. Everything about it went wrong and would go wrong in spite of him. His fences were continually falling to pieces. His cows would either go astray or get among the cabbages. Weeds were sure to grow quicker in his fields than anywhere else. The rain always made a point of setting in just as he had some outdoor work to do. How convenient, right? So that though his patrimonial estate had dwindled away under his management, acre by acre, until there was little more left than a mere patch of Indian corn and potatoes, yet it was the worst conditioned farm in the neighborhood. Again, if we think about Irving's characters and what makes them funny, it's always in their behavior, in their actions, their mannerisms, how they express themselves. And Rip's a great example of that. Think how he interacts with the villagers there, how he interacts, particularly when he comes back in after waking up, and how he sort of has to very carefully try to find out whether or not his wife, Dame Van Winkle, is still alive, and how he only announces that he is in fact Rip Van Winkle after he has determined that his wife is dead, right? Irving's Rip Van Winkle is the classic example of the henpecked husband. Um, he's a great character. I don't have too much to say about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow because we're not really focusing on that this semester, but this slide is still noteworthy for seeing how perhaps what Irving is doing in his stories is suggesting to his readers various sorts of American types. So if Rip is sort of the carefree, rather the carefree a henpecked husband who wants to avoid work at all costs, then Ichabod Crane sort of represents sort of the a bookworm, overly intellectual type of person. This is a nice passage from Leslie Fiedler. I've mentioned him to you all before in his study Love and Death in the American Novel. This is an excerpt from his interpretation of Rip Van Winkle, and in particular Rip as a character. The figure of Rip Van Winkle presides over the birth of the American imagination, and it is fitting that our first successful homegrown legend should memorialize, however playfully, the flight of the dreamer from the shrew into the mountains and out of time, away from the drab duties of home and town toward the good companions and the magic keg of beer. Ever since then, the typical male protagonist of our fiction has been a man on the run, harried into the forest or out to sea, down the river or into combat, anywhere to avoid civilization, which is to say the confrontation of a man and woman, which leads to the fall, to sex, to marriage, and ultimately responsibility. One of the factors that determines theme and form in our great books is this, what Fiedler calls famously, the strategy of evasion, this retreat to nature and childhood, which makes our literature and our life so charmingly and infuriatingly boyish. I think this is probably one of the most insightful pieces of criticism that I've read, not only on Rip Van Winkle, but on our American literature. Now, if we were in class, we would take on some of these questions. So I merely pose them to you here to consider after you have read Rip Van Winkle. Um, is it possible that Rip deliberately ran away from his wife and his responsibilities of child rearing and farming? I mean, think about that for an instant. Is it possible that this character has merely run away and not, quote unquote, fallen asleep? Right? So that's a possibility. How about that in a time with little mass communication, is it possible that during this time he could have lived in relative isolation and never even heard of the American Revolution, which has come and gone all during the time that our protagonist, our hero, Rip Van Winkle, has fallen asleep? Is it possible that his alibi, the story that we hear, that we are given by the narrator, is the story that he tells, where that he had gone into the woods, had met some funny small people, played a game of nine pin, bowling basically, got drunk on beer and fell asleep. Is it possible that this is merely a myth that he's adapted to suit his purposes? Is it possible that his description of the figures he meets are derived from a painting in the parlor of the village parson? If you read the narrative, if I'm remembering it correctly, there is a painting that hangs there. And is it possible that he has merely described what he's describing as what he has seen in a painting? Is it possible that upon his return he only identifies himself after he hears that his wife is dead? Well, that's the truth. That's a great section in the text I would encourage you to read closely. Is it possible that he changes his story until he finally settles on the one that we now have, vis-a-vis the narrator? Is it possible that not all of his villagers believe his story? Because the narrator says that some of the villagers did put, quote, their tongues in their cheeks, and that there was a general shaking of the head. Speaking of Irving's unreliable narrators, if we look at the bottom of this slide, if we think about Rip Van Winkle, is it possible, or should we think about this? Is the narrator's unreliability evident in how overly sympathetic and protective he is of Rip? And following that, this question here: is the narrator's portrait of Dame Van Winkle a fair one? Now, women, ladies, I should be hearing from you on this, right? It's probably not very fair. I mean, let's think about for a moment how Rip conducts himself, how he uh, is somehow manages to avoid all profitable labor, tends to everybody else's concerns in his village, helping out on other people's farms, but lets his own fall into disrepair. How he and his dog Wolf simply disappear up into the mountains to go hunting and fishing, while certainly there are chores to be done at home. And is Dame Van Winkle, his wife, is that presentation fair? Well, we would probably say no, right? She probably has every right to scold Rip and to expect better from him, right? So these two ideas, how the narrator seems to protect Rip and sympathizes more with him, and seems to paint a rather unfair portrait of a shrew in Dame Van Winkle, can, I think, maybe make a case for Irving's narrator not being quite reliable in their presentation of the story they give us. As we get toward the end here, I want to just drive home a couple points about Washington Irving. Washington Irving is America's first major romantic author. His nationalism reveals itself in the creation of an American mythology, and Rip Van Winkle and Ichabod Crane sit at the very center of this mythology. He celebrates nature with his descriptions of the Hudson Valley. We see it in Sleepy Hollow. We see it in the Rip Van Winkle story as well. How Irving describes just the beauty of the Catskill Mountains, how he paints really a picture for us, but not using paint, but using his words so that we have a very vivid and very memorable sense of this beautiful natural setting that his stories take place in. This slide doesn't really pertain too much to what we're doing this semester, since it talks about the legend of Sleepy Hollow and Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, The American Scholar, neither of which I presume that you have read. Um, but the last bullet, which character would be more acceptable to the American romantic imagination if we have on the one hand an Ichabod Crane or a Brom Bones? Um, I would tend to think that it would be Brom Bones, who is more romantic maybe than Ichabod Crane, because Ichabod Crane is a very intellectual. He's a school teacher. He's very effeminate. He's not athletic. He is not strong. Um, and in other words, Ichabod Crane is on one end of the extreme, and Brom Bones, who is very physical and very earthy in the sense that he's driven by primitive desires of food and drink and sex and violence and that sort of thing. Anyway, I hope that this presentation helped a little bit. If you have questions about Rip Van Winkle, about about Washington Irving, about his particular strain of romanticism, please do take to the discussion board and post that question. That way we can all sort of benefit uh, from your thoughts or your question. I know this is not the ideal way to go through this story, and it saddens me deeply that we're not together to discuss it in person. But this is the best that we can do, and it's all that we can do. I hope you guys are well, and we'll see you soon.